In Luke's gospel, Jesus was reported to have said, "From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded." In recent months, and more and longer, we've heard our political leaders make appeals to the idea of fairness to justify the notion of America first, which is being promoted as a touchstone of United States public policy, both foreign and domestic. We'll see in a little bit whether this really promotes fairness. But let's take a couple of examples in the news recently. First, health care. While there have been many objections to the Affordable Care Act, most of these problems could easily be fixed given a modicum of cooperation between the parties. Yeah, they're right, that's going to happen. Yeah. But there is a fundamental divide that the parties cannot overcome. The notion that some of us, those who are financially better off and healthier, would pay more so that those with less financial wherewithal or greater health problems can afford to purchase health insurance coverage. Now, for a long time, I couldn't figure out why there was such a strong and virulent opposition to the Affordable Care Act from many of the more conservative quarters, especially given the fact that the ACA was based on a model developed by the Heritage Foundation, which is a fairly conservative thinking organization. It was conservative and business friendly. Now, I'd not focused on the taxes that had been levied to pay for the cost of providing more universal coverage. And these taxes were, in fact, for the most part, applied to those who could well afford to pay them. Yet many people, even those who would benefit from the program, had a strong objection because those who they may have helped would be less deserving and still would get some benefit. Now, let's be honest, there was a racial element. The sobriquet Obamacare was applied to the program not out of a sense of trying to give President Obama credit for finally accomplishing a dream of universal coverage over many decades, but rather to tarnish a program with the name of a president the opponents viscerally disliked. But more to the point, there seemed to be a perception that some people felt that their hard-earned money was being used to benefit the undeserving other. The fundamental objection was it's not fair that some should have to pay higher taxes or premiums so that others could benefit. Now, a related aspect is the requirement that ACA-compliant insurance policies be required to provide certain essential benefits. The example that is used most often for this objection is the requirement that all policies provide contraception and maternity coverage. Why, it is asked, should a 55-year-old man be required to pay for maternity coverage? Ignoring for the moment the possibility that said 55-year-old could impregnate his 25-year-old girlfriend. Again, the response is, it's not fair. Now, a lot of practical responses could be made to this claim, but the fundamental issue that must be faced is where fairness fits into the picture. The climate change debate has raised this issue as well. In his Rose Garden address announcing that we were going to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Accords, the president did not at this time challenge the reality or even the causation of climate change as he had in the past. Rather, he argued that the proposed remedies in the Paris Accords were not fair to United States consumers and taxpayers. Why? Well, because President Obama had committed the United States to some stretch goals on emissions and a significant contribution to a fund to alleviate the effects of climate change, which would primarily be used in the poorer nations. The president said that these commitments were not fair to the United States when compared to developing countries like India or China. Again, of course, nothing was said about the centuries of carbon pollution dumped into the atmosphere by the United States and the other Western nations during their long period of industrialization in the 19th and 20th centuries. But why should we, 21st century Americans, give up our SUVs and our coal-powered generating plants to benefit citizens of Paris rather than Pittsburgh? This really, again, brings us back to the meaning of fairness. I'm reminding of a cartoon that periodically shows up in my Facebook news feed. Probably some of you have gotten it also, because we tend to run in the same channels. In it, there's a fence looking over onto a baseball game. There are 3 children of different heights. In one panel, the children are standing on a bench trying to look over the fence onto the field. The tallest child can easily see everything. The middle child can see if she stands on her tiptoes, but the shortest can't see anything. In the next panel, each child is standing on a platform of different heights, with the tallest child standing on the shortest platform, the middle on the medium, and the shortest on the tallest. The result is all of their heads are at the same level. The question is asked, which is more fair? Perhaps we should revisit Dobrin's 3 ideas of fairness, sameness, deservedness, and need. Clearly, these cartoons express the concept of sameness and need. In the first panel, the bench on all our standing is the same. Everybody starts at the same height. The different results are due to objective characteristics that are no one's fault. The children's are different heights, probably due to their different ages. If fairness is sameness, then the outcome is fair. But if fairness is based on need, then the outcome is not fair. Thus, by modifying the starting point to take into account different needs, arguably a more fair result is obtained. The tallest child is not unfairly disadvantaged. He still gets to see the game. He loses nothing to benefit the others. In the end, all have a fair shot at seeing the game. But what would happen if the 3 children had to contribute equal amounts of money to build the 3 platforms? The platform for the shortest child would cost more to build than the one for the tallest child. Is the tallest child being unfairly treated by contributing more than necessary to help him? And if his being tallest is due to healthy living on his part, doesn't he deserve this advantage? These concepts can also be applied to climate and healthcare debates. The argument that the administration makes for pulling out of the Paris Accords is that the U.S. should not be held to a higher standard of emissions reductions or contribution to the mitigation than other major industrializing powers, especially China, India, and the major EU countries. Fairness is sameness. Remaining in Paris can be justified as fair under the deservedness or need standards. Deservedness would look at the comparative amounts of carbon released by the United States over its entire industrializing history, and the same would probably apply to some of the European nations. Given that we were permitted to industrialize without accepting any limits on our emissions, we need to give some leeway to the newly industrialized states. That would be the need standard. A similar analysis can apply to healthcare. Under the sameness standard, people should be responsible for their own health care, and one group should not have to subsidize the other. In this view, health care is not a right, but an individual responsibility. The needs standard, on the other hand, recognizes health care as a communal responsibility, where those who are able to contribute more should assist those less able to do so. The deservedness standard tends to cut both ways. If we accept that health care is a communal responsibility, then those who are less healthy or less wealthy deserve assistance from the greater community. On the other hand, particularly as far as pre-existing conditions and health underwriting are concerned, some argue that people who engage in unhealthy activities or lifestyle choices that cause them to have chronic health conditions or diseases should be responsible for themselves, and the wider community should not have to pay for those choices. This would be application of the deservedness standard in a way that may seem harsh, but could be considered fair. Now, the passage from Luke that I quoted at the beginning of this reflection offers a view of fairness as well. It suggests somewhat a combination of the need and deservedness standards. It looks at the question of fairness from the perspective of the person who is receiving what is argued to be favored treatment. This passage would support an argument that those who have received favorable treatment in the past are now obligated to give back to the greater community. For example, those who have been fortunate to receive better health insurance and thus arguably have received better health care may now have to sacrifice for the less fortunate by either paying higher taxes or higher premiums. They can't simply pull up the drawbridge behind them. Similarly, those from countries that developed their economies in the 19th and 20th centuries cannot say, in effect, so sorry, we polluted the environment and used up the natural resources, but now that it's time to clean up, you'll need to fend for yourselves. And, oh, by the way, you'll have to bear an equal burden with us to clean up our mess. Sameness at this stage of the game is not necessarily fair. And as the Christian scriptures put it in another passage that one rarely sees on a billboard, bumper sticker, or sign at the Super Bowl, inasmuch as you have done this for the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you've done it for me. So does fairness mean absolute equality? In recent years, the Occupy movement, among others, have pointed out the inequalities between the 1% and the 99%. Writing in The Atlantic, the author Paul Bloom writes, Bernie Sanders talks about economic inequality all the time, and it's a message that resonates. You don't need to be a socialist to worry about the divide between rich and poor in America. Many Americans across the political spectrum claim to be deeply troubled by economic inequality, and many say they support changes that would yield a more equal distribution of income and wealth. But in his just published book on inequality, the philosopher Harry Frankfurt argues that economic equality has no intrinsic value. This is a moral claim, but it's also a psychological one. Frankfurt suggests that if people take the time to reflect, they'll realize that inequality isn't really what's bothering them. People might be troubled by what they see as unjust causes of economic inequality, a perfectly reasonable concern given how much your income and wealth are determined by accidents of birth, including how much money your parents had, your sex, and the color of your skin. We are troubled as well by the potential consequences of economic inequality. We may think it corrodes democracy or increases crime or diminishes overall happiness. Most of all, people worry about poverty. Not that some have less, but rather that those with less have too little. Bloom suggests the research shows that inequality in and of itself may not necessarily bother people, but an unfair system that results in serious inequality is troublesome to many. Now, certainly fairness is a Unitarian Universalist value. In addition to our old standby principles and purposes, the first, which is the inherent worth and dignity of everyone, and the seventh, which is the interdependent web of existence, our second principle, which we don't often quote really, is worthy of note. We remember that we covenant to promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And so we would hope that a fair world would also be a just, equitable, and compassionate one. Now, as Steve pointed out in his book this morning, children seem to have an inherent feeling for what is fair. While adults sometimes find a child's resort to the time-honored complaint, "It's not fair," annoying, we might do well to think about what they are saying. In a values curriculum entitled The 6 Pillars of Character, the author suggests how to be a fair person. These are the concepts. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Take turns. Tell the truth. Play by the rules. Think how your actions will affect others. Listen to people with an open mind. Don't blame others for your mistakes. Don't take advantage of other people. Don't play favorites. These seem like pretty good practices to follow in our daily lives. I suggest that we adults would do well to think more deeply what it means for us to act fairly and what it really means for things to be fair for all people. Fairness is not just thinking of ourselves, our group, our nation, our race first to be fair. America first is not necessarily a fair concept. Rather we do well to recommend Jesus' admonition. From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded. This is a challenge for all of us. Blessed be, and amen. Now, we're going to shift things around a little bit. We're going to do our closing hymn, and then we're going to